Gibson, Mississippi, 30 miles south of Vicksburg. He took the man at his word. Grant would then order 13th Corps under General John McClernand to start boarding transport ships and then march the ships onto Mississippi soil. As a result, the Army had crossed the Mississippi and landed and were below, therefore catching the Confederates completely off guard. But Grant knew that Confederate forces would advance to his area to thwart back the offensive. As a result, Confederate forces would attack a place called Fort Gibson. Fierce fighting would occur during the whole day. The 31st Illinois and other regiments would manage to get to Fort Gibson. But Confederate forces under John Bowen, part of Grand Gulf, part of the Army of Vicksburg, would march there to meet them. And on May 1st, the Battle of Fort Gibson would be fought in a pitched battle that lasted all day. Both Union and Confederate forces would fight back and forth. Eventually, the 31st Illinois, along with their other Union comrades, would repulse the Confederate attack and win a major victory for the road open to Vicksburg. But however, there was a problem. General Nathaniel Banks and his army were crossing the Mississippi as well. He and his army were attacking further downriver against the defenses of Port Hudson, Louisiana, another important supply area for the Confederacy. If Banks could defeat the Confederate forces there quickly, he could join Grant and advance on Vicksburg. Banks' attack at Fort Gibson was repulsed, however, and therefore settled for a siege on the town. Therefore, Halleck ordered Grant to wait for Banks until he advanced on Vicksburg. But at the same time, Grant knew that action and maneuver and speed was of the essence. Because of Grant's army being in deep enemy territory along an established supply line, Grant did not want to be held down by Banks or Halleck's order to wait. As a result, Grant took a huge risk and decided to cut himself off from his main supply line at Grand Gulf in Milliken's Bend. Then ordered his army to live off the land as they marched through Mississippi, essentially foraging food, clothing, and other essential items that a soldier needed. So right after Fort Gibson, Grant ordered his army to start advancing to the east, or to cut off Vicksburg's main supply base at Jackson, the capital of Mississippi. Grant knew the risk he took in marching through deep enemy territory. Because of the many Confederate forces that outnumbered his army by a thin margin, Grant only had 42 to 43,000 men in his army, while the Confederate armies in the area outnumbered them from a high ratio at about 52 to 53,000, possibly around 60,000 Confederates. Once the army started advancing toward Jackson, Confederate forces started advancing the column in a town a couple miles outside Jackson called Raymond. Grant's corps commanders would then send their divisions, specifically under James McPherson's corps, to thwart this counter-offensive. James Newton of the 14th Wisconsin described the marching prior to Raymond. If our brigade starts from here soon enough, I should not wonder if we would have a finger in the pie. The officers have been notified that they had better lay in 10 days' provision to get themselves in readiness for march at a moment's notice. That looks as though we shouldn't stay here long. Now, May 12th, they encountered these Confederate forces and would fight a fierce battle that lasted all day. Sometimes the soldiers would compare this fight at Raymond to Shiloh in its intensity. Once they reached Jackson, they met other Confederate forces that united from Fort Gibson and Raymond and defeat Grant to drive him back. However, there was a problem for the Confederates. Their defenses were not well fortified. The Confederate army at Jackson, under the command of Joseph E. Johnston, had a different strategy in mind when it came to Jackson and its importance. When he arrived in Jackson on the evening of May 13th, he decided that his situation was hopeless. Johnston only had 6,000 troops on hand. So as a result, they would retreat and await reinforcements. As a result, fighting lasted throughout the day on May 14th on the outskirts of Jackson. But when Union troops would advance and drive back the Confederate defenders, and as a result, entered and captured Jackson and eventually fly the United States flag. Jackson became the third Confederate state capital after Nashville and Baton Rouge to fall. Grant discovered that Johnston had retreated to Clinton, Mississippi, so as a result, he did not take Johnston's bait and ordered Sherman's 15th Corps to stay in Jackson and destroy military supplies, food, ammunition, anything that may help the Confederate armies in the region, as well as Vicksburg. Grant knew that Pemberton and Johnston might reunite their armies and thwart the campaign. As a result, Grant ordered McClernand and McPherson and his men to advance west. Grant and a portion of his army would march to intercept Pemberton's army at a place called Champion's Hill, a hill near plantation land owned by the Champion family, mainly Sid Champion. Grant and his forces would attack the hill on the night of May 15th. Many would not expect a fierce battle the next day, but the battle following the morning would be the bloodiest of the campaign. It would be up there in carnage like Shiloh. It would happen on May 16th. Pemberton's army would then reach defensive positions on the hill, creating a heavily fortified position to carry heavy casualties. Pemberton believed his army could thwart back the offensive Grant was throwing at him, but the fight on this day would reconsider that otherwise. McPherson's corps would then, on May 16th, advance across the defensive line on Champions Hill. Soldiers' count would describe musketry and artillery fire as the worst firing that they have ever heard during the war, putting the battle next to Shiloh in intensity. Intense and bloody back-and-forth fighting would traverse on the wooded slopes. Intense hand-to-hand combat would ensue where soldiers used the butts of their muskets, bayonets, and knives to thwart each other's efforts to drive them from the field. As a result, this back-and-forth fighting would occur across the lines. The fighting, as before at Raymond Jackson, would last all day. At one point in the battles, Confederates drove Union regiments from the hilltop positions. Grant would ride up to these regiments, just like he did at Shiloh. That consisted of the 5th Iowa, 53rd Illinois, and others to calmly rally them in order to, told them to advance to drive back the Confederate defenses to the top of the hill. They would do that, and they would rally and drove back the Confederates to the top of the hill. Grant noticed a line in the Confederate line that a certain gap occurred in their defenses. Grant then ordered another group of soldiers in one division to exploit this gap in the Confederate line. Once the Union regiments rallied, Grant issued orders to all commanders to attack the gap and drive Pemberton's army away from Champions Hill. Once the Union assault took the position, the Confederate line collapsed and Pemberton ordered a full retreat back to Vicksburg. Champion Hill was a major victory for the Union to take it. As a result, other fighting in places such as the Big Black River would also occur that also resulted in Union victory. The Vicksburg campaign would be one of the most important, most flawless sets of modern military campaigning in U.S. history. With the claims of Grant being a butcher, the campaign and its battles proved otherwise when Grant biographer and historian Ron Chernow wrote, contrary to his image of securing victories at heavy cost, Grant had sacrificed 4,300 men versus 7,200 for the Confederates, and sometimes it would be around 10,000 to 12,000 Confederate casualties. Even though he had tackled a combined Confederate force at Vicksburg, Randolph, and Jackson of more than 60,000 men, much larger than the 43,000 transferred across the Mississippi. The next days and months would be the most crucial aspect of the entire war, because while the campaign was going on, Robert E. Lee and his army started conducting a second invasion of the North, which would result in the Battle of Gettysburg. Vicksburg had to be taken by any means necessary, whether it was through siege or through assaults in the city's defenses that Grant's army overlooked when started gathering from the Vicksburg's forts and defenses. The next day, May 18th, Grant and his army started surrounding the town and its defenses due to additional reinforcements being sent to him. An assault of the city occurred on May 19th from Sherman, but resulted in heavy casualties for Sherman. Grant then on May 22nd decided to see if he could capture the defenses in full, also because of his scared notion that he was believed that the Confederates could be reinforced. At the appointed hour, after Grant's 3 chief commanders synchronized their watches, novelty in wartime, 3 corps raced forward with fixed bayonets, skin ladders, and ropes to surmount the sheer Vicksburg parapets. Although some troops neared the works even planted their flags, they had to ward off Confederate fire and could not puncture the thick shell that shielded Vicksburg. The result was a bloodbath. As a result of the attacks, Union casualties for the day approached 3,200. Probably a third of them occurred in the afternoon assaults. James Newton, 14th Wisconsin, again would write later home about the heavy casualties that his company suffered in the assaults. After realizing this, Grant would request a brief ceasefire to gather the dead and bury them, as well as gathering the wounded back to Union hospitals behind the lines. Grant would then issue Special Orders Number 140 proclaiming the start of siege operations. Despite the failure of the assaults, Grant and his army knew the objectives that were in front of them. The soldiers in Grant's army did believe they were going to be killed during the assault, but at the same time, the men believed they could take Vicksburg by storm and wanted to try. Even though the Union soldiers would be critical of Grant's decision to assault Vicksburg, they still loved them and believed that they could take Vicksburg. Grant was settled in for a siege, cutting off every major soldier the Confederates could get, implementing new devices to break the Confederate will there throughout the rest of the siege. he would go to his army engineers, start digging entrenchments near the Confederate lines. Adding to new entrench lines, Grant also brought along naval siege guns to further pulverize the Confederate defenses. On May 25th, the siege would begin from land and sea. The Navy and Grant's army are to bombard the defenses with incessant and non-stop fire, not only on the Confederate defenses, but sometimes shells would land on the town as well. Civilians would dig caves in the hillsides surrounding Vicksburg and would take shelter from the intense bombardment that occurred every single day. Soldiers in the city would sometimes be blown apart by shells from the river and on land. Sometimes hospitals would accidentally be hit by Union shells. Civilians, whenever they heard a shell coming into town, would seek shelter as fast as they can until a shell would hit very, very fast. The front lines, though, were just as intense. Confederate artillery also fired back, forcing many Union soldiers to also dig caves in the hillsides as well as for protection, and scatter once they heard a shell coming into their lines. Union soldiers were also blown apart by the intense Confederate artillery fire. Osborne Aldroyd, a sergeant of Company E of the 20th Ohio, who participated in the assaults prior to the siege as well as the campaign, described his diary of the siege he witnessed daily. Coat and hat were elevated on a stick above our rifle pits, and in an instant they were riddled with bullets from the enemy. The rebels were a little excited at the ruse. In their eagerness, a few of them raised their heads a little bit above their breastworks when 100 bullets flew at them from our side. They all dropped instantly, and we could not tell whether they were hit or not. The rebels, as well as ourselves, occasionally held up a hat by way of diversion. A shell from an enemy's gun dropped into our camp rather unexpectedly and burst near a group, wounding several, but not only slightly, though the doctor thinks one of the wounded will not be able to sit down comfortably for a few days. And sometimes blood would run in these trenches as a result of these shells. Both Union and Confederate armies in their trench raids not only lobbed shells at each other, but again, also shot at each other in the form of sharpshooters. The Union sharpshooter was the most dangerous man on the Vicksburg siege line. His mini balls were the deadliest missiles of all, killing and maiming more enemy combatants by far than artillery or mortar fire. Federal riflemen were more effective than the rebel counterparts because of the sheer volume of their fire. But Confederate sharpshooters were also deadly in killing men that popped out of their trenches. Each week, the artillery and rifle fire created a mass killing zone from the siege lines to the river that would happen all day and night. But each day, the Confederates would not cry wolf and did not surrender. In the 6th week of the siege, Grant was trying to figure out how to puncture the line and force a surrender. Grant's soldiers, on the other hand, May 26, 300 troops from Logan's division, McPherson's corps, working in 100-man shifts, have been digging a trench toward the Louisiana Redan, commanded by a 3rd Louisiana Regiment, under the direction of their corps self-trained engineer, Captain Andrew Hickenloper. The reason for this digging was the creation of something bold to break through Confederate lines and take Vicksburg. Some of these implements consisted of fuses that would blow through the lines, close sharpshooter support, and artillery close to the lines guaranteed this. But something else was needed to break the line itself. By June 22nd, the head of the staff reached the exterior slope of the Redan, and the Louisianians began bombarding the crews with hand grenades and 12-pound shells rolled by hand. This created many casualties among Union diggers, mostly from northwestern Illinois, where it consisted of men from Galena, where Grant lived for a year, Galena, Illinois, the 45th Illinois that I mentioned earlier when they fought at Shiloh. This mining effort would create a mine that was meant to blow a hole in the Confederate trenches. When Grant heard of this, he approved the effort and called for an assault to bust through the Confederate lines and destroy Pemberton's army or force their surrender. On June 25th, they assembled thousands of assault troops to the south and the trench friends for the 45th Illinois to lead my regiment, which spearheaded the opening assault. Grant would join McPherson to watch the assault unfold, and around 3 o'clock in the afternoon on June 25th, the mine went off in a tremendous explosion, sending Confederate soldiers, horses, and artillery into the air. Sometimes whole companies or regiments were destroyed by this violent explosion. The mine under Fort Hill was sprung. The earth trembled as if an earthquake were passing. There was a momentary pause, a loud yell of triumph. An infantry fixed with bayonets dashed into the crater made by the explosion, as one soldier from the 31st Illinois described it. Once the explosion ended, Confederate cannon fire started shelling the Confederate position at the Redan and other points, providing fire support. The soldiers had advanced double quick, and maybe, just maybe, Vicksburg would be theirs. But there was a problem. The explosion had destroyed only half of the Redan, and the sausage-shaped crater was far smaller than engineers expected, only 12 feet deep and 30 feet wide, nor had the rebel troops been decimated. As a result of this error, Union soldiers would enter into a slaughter zone where Confederate soldiers from protected positions hurled shells and artillery at the advancing soldiers. Confederate and Union soldiers on the parapet would be involved in a bloody, intense hand-to-hand fighting, as well as the violent musketry and artillery that went off around them. The 45th Illinois would fight as long as they could. As a result, the fighting would last 26 hours. Just imagine this back and forth fighting going in this crater. 26 hours. It's nonstop. The Lead Mine Regiment held on until 6 that evening. The 31st also fought fiercely. Pools of blood were visible in the crater, as well as gore. As a result of the assault, Grant and McPherson called it off because of the heavy casualties. As a result, he resumed the siege of the town and its lines. Another mine would explode a couple days later. July 1st would explode in Puxterland, but Grant did not order the assault because of the failed one on June 25th. But this sent a message to the Confederates saying, "We will blow up every single part of the line until you surrender." Then a day later, Pemberton's soldiers, a couple days later, on July 3rd, have had enough. They begged him to surrender, basically saying in a letter, "If you cannot feed us, then you better surrender us." At mid-morning on July 3rd, the guns went silent on the siege lines, and curious soldiers watched two Confederate officers approach the Union lines bearing a white flag. They would eventually go to an interview site where Pemberton talked with Grant discussing the issues of surrender. But there was a catch. Grant would negotiate that the Army would surrender unconditionally like the Army did at Fort Donelson. The same measures and rules that he made toward Buckner, but Pemberton presented him with a condition of his Army, and then Grant had a change of heart. Grant presented Pemberton with generous terms which would enable Confederate soldiers to save face and surrender with traditional military honors. At breakfast time, Grant sat in his tent with an orderly arrived with Pemberton's submission to those final terms. On the next day, July 4th, and Carol, if you could pass the picture where it shows the ships in the background, it should be the first one. Next day, July 4th, Independence Day, Union men stared in respectful signs as their Confederate counterparts, one regiment at a time, marched out of Vicksburg, deposited their arms in stacks, and then retreated to their lines. The Confederacy was cut in two. Union control of the Mississippi was complete, and traffic for Union supplies could go down south throughout the river. Grant, instead of asking under the surrender, decided to parole the 31,000 Confederate soldiers. They were allowed to go home with their firearms, their horses, and other items. But there was an exception. Officers and soldiers could not take their slaves, and were asked to let their slaves go. With the taking of Vicksburg, slavery and its economic and social importance to Mississippi was wiped out. But with the cherry on top, the Union Army of the Potomac repulsed Lee's invasion of the North at Gettysburg the day prior, just as Confederate forces at Vicksburg surrendered. Lee and his army were retreating back to Virginia, create a much-needed boost for Northern morale, and maintain the goal to win the war and destroy slavery for good. But Vicksburg proved the greatest loss to the Confederacy's morale. Union casualties were around 4,000 to 7,000 casualties, a net loss of 7 to 9%. Confederate casualties during the campaign siege were 10 to 12,000 casualties, again, sometimes around 20,000, including 31,000 Confederate soldiers surrendering, a total of 45,000 to 53,000 casualties, a net loss of 100%. This clearly shows that the butcher myth is a lie. After that, Grant would eventually win at the Battle of Chattanooga, eventually providing Union victory, pulling Rosecrans out of the Battle of Chickamauga, and would, at Chattanooga, sometimes see the Confederate soldiers that he paroled at Vicksburg. Now, why is that? Mainly because soldiers coming home, mainly to Louisiana, noticed that their families claimed that they were polluted by slaves, basically means being attacked by slaves. And this resulted in soldiers re-enlisting into the Confederate Army. And these are poor Confederate soldiers, may I add. They're poor white Confederate soldiers. Grant would see these men at Chattanooga, and as a result, instead of asking them to surrender again, he would take up his hat in respect until a group of prisoners passed after the Battle of Chattanooga. And eventually Grant would later come east And Carol, if you could pass the other picture around that shows him in the Eastern Theater. After the Battle of the Wilderness, he would come and basically talk with Lincoln and basically say, no matter what happens when we fight against Lee, there will be no turning back. And you can see, as a result of the rest of the story, Grant would win. He would beat Robert E. Lee and eventually win the Civil War for the United States. And as you see in the picture, you can see the determination on his face, despite the burning wilderness around him. And the men in the Army of the Potomac wanted to get after the Confederates after Gettysburg. They had unfinished business with them. And after the years and years of after fighting the battles of Virginia and Pennsylvania and retreating, the soldiers in the Army of the Potomac, once they saw Grant writing down, basically said, "We're moving south. We're not retreating. We're moving south. We're going." And eventually, despite heavy casualties in the Overland Campaign, which is, if you want to learn about the horrors of Civil War combat, I suggest reading about that campaign. It's horrific. They would eventually win, and Grant would squeeze Lee tightly around Petersburg, Virginia, and would grant him the same terms that he presented to Pemberton at Vicksburg. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for coming out today. And I will definitely take questions from all of you, and I will come inside there to answer any questions you guys have. Thank you so much.